Okay, next major endocrine tissue outside of the anterior and posterior pituitary is thyroid. So the thyroid, you guys have hopefully explored that anterior view, posterior view, explored this in lab. This is, believe it or not, a slide that's not even as good as our slides. All right, so here are these structures called follicles when we look at this gland on a microscopic level. And then we'd have cells that are not associated with a follicle or circle, and they would be the parafollicular. So, and we bring this to your attention because the follicular cells are responsible for making thyroid hormones, the thyroxine and the triiodothyronine, whereas the para or extrafollicular cells are responsible for calcitonin, right? And this sits just inferior to the larynx and anterior to the trachea, and then the parathyroids are going to be really embedded in the posterior. So, control-wise, these guys are ultimately affected by the hypothalamus, right? Because it was thyroid-stimulating hormone that caused the release of thyroid hormones. So, when TSH binds, right, to receptors on these follicular cells, right? Because remember that's a non-steroid. Then these follicular cells start transporting more iodide. Iodide is really important for finishing up making triiodothyronine and thyroxine, right? So it kind of, once we have TSH around, we really accelerate this combination, and then stimulates the endocytosis of the colloid into the follicular cells, so they get taken back up and they cleave so that triiodothyronine and thyroxine are free and released into the blood, and then they circulate through the body. All right. So these are notorious for affecting metabolism, and metabolism is really has to do with the sum of all chemical reactions in the body, but generally chemical reactions that involve energy release or energy need. Right. So that's why the mitochondria is shown here, and we know that thyroxine, T3 and T4 around, that there's an increase in the metabolic rate. All right, so here we start off with that, rate and or concentration. So if you have low metabolic rate, the hypothalamus releases, right, its releasing hormone triggers the stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary to be dumped in. Goes through targets, so TSH targets the thyroid, as we already figured out, and that triggers the release of T3 and T4 into the blood. All right, so T3 and T4 are very important for increasing the basic metabolic rate of cells, and that then by default is going to cause the temperature of the body to increase. All right. Well, these are very energy needy, right? When you have T3 and T4 around, you need a lot more energy. So, say here that some of the effects of this are to increase the breakdown of nutrients such as glucose and increase the delivery and availability of oxygen, all again so that the mitochondria can continue operating and making ATP. So once these thyroxine levels and triiodothyronine levels get too high, we basically, this is a negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to stop, because again, we just want to regulate metabolism. All right, thyroid hormones are needed for protein synthesis, so we can kind of couple these with the idea of growth hormone. They're critical for development of the nervous system, and they influence reproductive function and sensitivity. So they enhance, again, your sympathetic fight or flight, which is also, again, a very energy needy state, right? Another hormone from the thyroid, of course, is calcitonin. And calcitonin is released not due to the hypothalamus, but due to the level of calcium in the blood, so humoral stimuli. So when calcium is high, right, calcitonin is going to bring it down. And it does this by targeting bone, kidney, and intestines. Again, negative feedback, so it's only going to bring it down far enough, and then once it's lowered, it's going to stop. We're going to stop making calcitonin. So how does it lower blood calcium levels? Well, it inhibits osteoclasts. Remember, they're the bone destroyers, so we're not resorbing is the term we use, bone, and therefore releasing the calciums and the phosphates back into the blood. So we stop that process because we've got plenty of calcium in the blood. We're going to stimulate osteoblasts, blast the builders. So they're going to, now the calcium's going to come out of the blood and into the bone and be stored in the bone as calcium phosphate. We're going to tell the kidneys, calcitonin specifically, to pee away this excess calcium. And we're going to tell the small intestines, right, to not, right, absorb as much calcium from our diet. And all of that should have the effect of bringing back down the stores of our blood level of calcium, so lowering it back down. So parathyroid gland is the opposite, right? When the levels of calcium are too low, we need to bring them up. So I said it also affects the kidneys to form calcitriol, which is active vitamin D. So there we add that. It's kind of the opposite in the other regards. You know, if we think about, so we would inhibit osteoblasts, stimulate osteoclasts, right? Decrease kidney excretion, increase calcium absorption, right? And then we also say that it also targets the kidneys to get the kidneys to make active vitamin D. And this is important because vitamin D, once it's activated, will help with our absorption of, right, our dietary calcium, right? So I didn't ask students to identify these cells specifically in the parathyroid. I just said you should be able to tell a parathyroid gland from the thyroid, and hopefully that's pretty easy. Hope. So this cartoon just kind of walks you through what I said, right? When calcium levels drop, we can't tolerate that in the body, so we release parathyroid hormone. This then dumped into the blood. Here we see the effects of that, right? So on the bone, inhibits osteoblasts. So no building of bone. We want to dissolve the bone. So stimulate osteoclasts and release calcium back into the blood. All right. We also see that we can have an influence on the kidneys, right? So stimulate them to recover calcium from the urine, or right, increase our reabsorption is the term we use for that, of calcium. And then also the tubule cells release calcitriol, which will help us absorb calcium from our diet. And so here's our effects on calcitriol on the intestine. So we'd also see then, once we get calcitriol made, active vitamin D, we would then see more movement of calcium from, right, the middle of the tube where our food is, into our cells and then into our blood. So thereby, right, raising the calcium levels. That's the key here. All of these we're going to increase calcium in the blood. All right. So if we get too high, then we're going to have negative feedback, and you don't want to keep on dissolving your bones, right, and keep on dumping more and more calcium in the blood. You wanted to get it to the point where it's balanced. The adrenal glands, we look at these in lab. This is a really a nice slide to show this. A lot of our slides aren't quite that nice. But it shows you again, this is the outer part, and it's the majority of the adrenal glands, called the cortex. And then we see a little bit of the medulla. I said the medulla is always evident because it's just not as well organized. So the medulla is really, this is the one example of a target of the autonomic nervous system. So autonomic nervous system stimuli or control. And when the autonomic nervous system gets activated, then the adrenal medulla, the cells here, make and release epinephrine. All right? The cortex is influencing a variety of different things. So these are all steroids from the cortex, and epinephrine is not, right? So all steroids here. And they regulate stress, like cortisol, blood pressure. Aldosterone helps with that. Blood volume, aldosterone helps with that. Nutrient uptake and storage, that's cortisol, really, and some aldosterone. Fluid and electrolyte balance, aldosterone, and inflammation. We get that, a little bit of that. That's a cortisol job, right? And then from the zona reticularis, we get these chemicals called androgens, and they really stimulate their male-generating compounds, right? So zona fasciculata is the glucocorticoids, which the most common is cortisol, right? And in the glomerulosa, it's the mineralocorticoids. All right, so this just walks through each one of these zones, right? Again, the zona glomerulosa makes mineralocorticoids. The primary one is aldosterone, and it helps us with fluid and electrolyte balance. So It really focuses on the electrolyte balance, and then the fluid is kind of an indirect consequence. So aldosterone, when is it going to be around? Well, it's going to be around if you have a problem with sodium that's low or potassium that's high. And then the last circumstance we give here is blood volume or pressure that's low. In any of these circumstances, aldosterone will increase to address these problems. Right? I also mentioned that it can be affected when ACTH is released. Right? So, what does it do to restore balance? Well, a primary target is the kidneys. If we're talking about fluid and electrolyte imbalances, the kidneys are very much in control of that. The intestines, sweat glands, and salivary glands all have some influence as well on fluids and electrolytes because we lose, right, some fluids and electrolytes through these routes. So what does it do? Well, it causes, right, potassium to be excreted, right, so peed away, and sodium to be reabsorbed or retained. So it stays in the body. We don't lose any more sodium, right? And because of this influence on sodium, when sodium is returned to the body or reabsorbed in the kidneys, then water will follow it. So that's why we say, which will increase blood volume. And once we have more volume, we will have more pressure. Now, aldosterone is also influenced by the RAA system when your blood volume or pressure is too low. All right. Still in the cortex, we have the glucocorticoids, and the zona fasciculata makes those. Cortisol is a number one example of this. It's controlled by really the hypothalamus, but also some other things have like stress. And again, long-term or chronic stress really stimulates cortisol release. All right, so how does it restore balance? It's balance first and foremost. It has to do with glucose. So, and again, when you're in a stress state, you need energy. It's an energy demanding state. So you use up glucose quickly. So cortisol is going to help you to keep your glucose levels constant in the blood. Right? So I say it does this by sparing glucose and even increasing the levels. Okay, and has some regulation of the immune system here. Right? So how will we manage this? Well, our targets, if it's a nutrient, are often liver, adipose, and muscle, and that's indeed what we have here. So the breakdowns are in protein, so I can use amino acids for energy, fat, break down fat when cortisol's around, and break down glycogen. So these are really all examples of freeing up energy, ultimately, for the body, because of the state we're in, the physiological state we're in. And then lastly, something it stimulates, right, it causes to happen, is also the process of gluconeogenesis. And this is specifically something the liver does, and that's why this is the sole target in this case. And this means genesis is formation, forming new glucose. So we're also, in order to maintain blood glucose levels, we have the capability of forming new glucose when cortisol's around. Right? And then the zona reticularis is androgens. It means a male generator. This is controlled also by the ACO hypothalamus, is responsible for stimulating the production and release of androgens. So what these androgens will do will help convert testosterone or estrogen. And both males and females make a little bit of these androgens. And it is the main source of estrogen after menopause in females, because the ovaries are going to stop making that. In fact, the ovaries just flat out stop listening to the brain, honestly, in menopause. The adrenal medulla, still the inner part of that, is the only hormone, again, stimulated by the autonomic, the neural system outright. And it's a response to short-term stress, right? So acute stress. Targets liver or skeletal muscle, right? So, and we convert glycogen to glucose here. So again, we're freeing up energy because we're in a fight or flight. And once we free up energy, we can use that to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure. So these are going to help us do the fighting or flighting. Dilate the bronchioles, dilate or constrict blood vessels. It really depends, to change flow of blood to organs. Dilates the pupils for more light in, so we have more acute or better vision. We lose our peripheral vision. We don't care about anything but what's directly in front of us. We become very focused in a fight or flight state. Right? Right? We'll pick up on the pineal gland and melatonin on the next one.